Derek opened his eyes early in the morning, feeling completely rested. As soon as the rays of the sun began to make their way through the curtains, he slowly got out of bed so as not to wake his wife Louise. She was lying next to me, covered with a thin blanket. Her face was calm, her hair was neatly spread out on the pillow. It was a familiar moment for him to admire her, while she was still asleep, and think about how lucky he was. It was his ritual, his quiet gratitude to fate for choosing him. Derek had loved Louise ever since he first saw her. He remembered that day she was standing in the corner of a crowded hall at a charity event he was organizing. Her smile was scorching, her gaze penetrated to the depths of her soul. Then he approached her, offered her a glass of champagne, and since then he could not imagine his life without her. He did everything to make her happy. Derek was a successful entrepreneur who owned a small but profitable car repair business. He worked a lot, but he always found time for Louise. On anniversaries, he gave her expensive jewelry, arranged trips to exotic resorts, and even tried to be the perfect husband in small things. But behind all this perfect facade, there was a truth that he refused to notice. This morning, Derek decided to cook breakfast for Louise. He got up, trying not to make a sound, and headed for the kitchen. The smell of freshly ground coffee filled the house, adding a cozy touch to the morning atmosphere. Eggs and bacon were frying in a frying pan, and toast was being prepared next to it. He did all this with love, hoping that Louise would be pleased. When Louise finally woke up and went downstairs to the kitchen, her face did not reflect the gratitude that Derek had expected. She seemed distracted, as if her thoughts were somewhere far away.
Good morning, sweetheart. I made your favorite breakfast, eggs with bacon and toast. I hope you're hungry.
He smiled, expecting to see a smile in return, but her gaze was somehow empty. Louise automatically picked up a cup of coffee, took a sip, and, with a slight grimace, put it on the table.
Thanks, Derek, but to be honest, I'm not hungry. I have to go to a meeting today. I'd rather have a coffee.
That answer sounded like a knife in Derek's heart, but he pretended not to notice. He used to ignore such little things, convincing himself that Louise was just getting tired of the daily routine.
Are you sure? I took a little time to prepare everything. Maybe at least a piece.
Her eyes briefly rested on his, but he did not see the warmth in them that had been there before.
No, really, I'm in a hurry. I have a lot to do today. I'm sorry.
Louise got up from the table without looking at him. She left the kitchen, leaving Derek alone at the table. He watched the cooling eggs remain untouched on her plate. Awkwardness hung in the air, as if frozen between them. But Derek still had hope. He was sure that everything would be fine. She was just tired. She needed more time for herself, that's what he kept telling himself. He put away the dishes and went to the door to see Louise off, as always. She went to the mirror at the entrance, straightening her long black hair, perfectly arranged in a high hairstyle. Picking up her bag, Louise turned to Derek.
Don't wait for me tonight. I may be late. We have a meeting with potential clients, so I can come back late.
You know, I'm always waiting for you whenever you come back. But be careful, okay? And if something changes, write to me.
He looked at her with a soft smile, still hoping that her cold attitude was just temporary difficulties. But Louise just nodded, turned away and walked out the door. When she left, the house suddenly seemed empty and quiet. Derek stood at the window, watching Louise's car drive away. Her black BMW quickly disappeared around the corner, leaving him alone. Derek sighed and went to his office to do business. He immersed himself in his work as usual, but thoughts of Louise did not leave him. He remembered how a year ago they went to Italy to celebrate the 5th anniversary of their marriage. Everything seemed perfect then. Louise was laughing, enjoying every moment, and he was happy to see her like this. But something has changed in the last year. She became more distant, as if something was bothering her, but she didn't share her thoughts with him. Derek tried to talk to her about it several times, but each time she waved him off, saying that everything was fine. He attributed it to her job. Louise was an interior designer, and often her schedule was stressful, with endless meetings and projects. He thought it was just stress. But now everything has become too obvious to ignore. Derek decided that he would try to talk to her again tonight. He has to figure out what's going on. Maybe she just needs more attention. Maybe they are too far away from each other because of work and daily routine. At this time, Louise was driving along the road, peering through the windshield and thinking about something else entirely. Her thoughts were not about Derek, not about work, but about Mr. Johnson. He had recently moved into the house next door, and something had changed in her world since their first meeting. His confidence, his calmness, even his age, all attracted her. She had never thought that she would be interested in such a man, but every time she saw him, something flashed in her heart. He didn't look like Derek at all. If Derek was the perfect husband, then Mr. Johnson was someone forbidden, something new and exciting. It lacked the predictability and routine that had filled her life with Derek. She felt different around him, more alive, more free. Derek sat in his office and leafed through the documents, but his thoughts were far from work. His mind was full of questions he was afraid to ask. Why did Louise become so detached? Why did he feel that they were getting further and further apart? He couldn't stand this uncertainty any longer. In the evening he would try to talk to her again, but this time he would not let her get away from the conversation. He had no idea that the conversation he had been waiting for would change his life forever. Louise has never believed in true love. For her, the world has always been divided into those who have and those who strive to have. She grew up in a poor family where she had to pull every dollar. Her mother worked nights as a nurse at a local clinic, and her father, whom she hardly knew, had long since left, leaving the family to fend for themselves. From an early age, Louise understood that love is a luxury that only those who already have everything can afford. She saw how her mother suffered day after day trying to feed them, and decided for herself that her life would be completely different. Louise knew what she wanted: stability, money, respect. Her ideal was the life she saw in glossy magazines, beautiful houses, expensive cars, perfect men in impeccable suits. To achieve this, she realized early on that looks alone are not enough. You need to be cunning, smart, be able to choose the right moments and people. And when she met Derek, she knew this was her chance. He was the perfect target: successful, kind, generous, but most importantly, defenseless before her charm. Louise immediately realized that Derek would fall in love with her at first sight, and her plan began to work. She always knew how to present herself correctly: a smile at the right moment, a light laugh, a gentle look. And it worked. Derek was charmed. A few years before they met, Louise was sitting in a cafe with her friend Carol, discussing the prospects of her life. They were old friends, but their life goals had long since diverged. Carol, with her romantic ideas about the world, believed in love, loyalty, and the right relationship. Louise listened to her talk about how Carol dreamed of finding a real man, but only rolled her eyes.
You don't understand, Louise. Love is not about money. You can be with someone who has nothing and still be happy if it's a real person.
Seriously? Carol, let's be honest. Do you want to be happy with a guy who earns less than you? Happy with a guy who can't afford you a beautiful life? Love doesn't pay the bills, darling.
Louise took a long sip of her latte, glancing at her friend with a slight grin. She had long ago decided for herself that she would not become a victim of romantic illusions.
Well, it's not all about that. I just can't imagine being with someone just for the money. It's going to be an empty life.
Come on. After all these tales of love are for those who don't want to admit reality. In life, it is important to have a plan and follow it. And my plan is to live the way I want. And for that, I need a man who can provide it.
Carol sighed heavily, looking at her friend as if trying to figure out how she could have become so cynical. But Louise has long since left behind dreams of true love. In the world where she lived, it all came down to profit. A few months passed, and Louise met Derek at one of the charity events that she went to, not for noble purposes, but for the sake of dating. He was exactly what she was looking for: successful, handsome, and most importantly, completely unprepared to recognize her true motives. They started dating, and Louise did everything to gain his trust. She was the perfect friend. She supported him in all his endeavors, praised him for his success, was there when he wanted it. Everything was according to plan. Derek thought he had found the woman of his dreams, and soon asked her to marry him. For Louise, this was not a surprise, but just another step towards the life she had planned for herself. They got married a year after they met, and Derek was happy. He did everything to make her happy: expensive gifts, trips, dinners at the best restaurants. All this became a regular part of her life. But despite all his efforts, Louise never felt the real love that Carol had once talked about. For her, Marriage was like a business deal. Each partner fulfills their obligations. Derek gave her comfort and stability, and she gave him the illusion of a perfect wife. Deep down, she always knew that she didn't love him, and that one day this deal will no longer suit her. One evening, several years after their wedding, Louise was sitting on the terrace of their house, watching the sunset. She was holding a glass of wine in her hands, but her thoughts were somewhere else. Her life was perfect for prying eyes. She lived in a beautiful house, she had a loving husband, and she had everything she once dreamed of. But something inside her was bursting. All these things that seemed important to her suddenly became meaningless. She could feel the emptiness growing inside her. Then Derek came up to her. He sat down next to her, putting his hand on her shoulder. His face was tired after a long day at work, but there was still tenderness in his eyes.
Hard day.
Yes, a little bit. There's a lot to do at work.
He nodded, realizing that there was no need to ask unnecessary questions. Derek was always tactful, never pressured her when she didn't want to talk.
I think we should get some rest. How about a trip? We can go somewhere quiet and peaceful. You've been saying for a long time that you want to go to the mountains.
Louise looked at him, but she no longer felt anything inside. Everything that had once seemed so important now seemed meaningless to her. Even the offer of a trip did not arouse any joy or interest in her.
Maybe, but now is not the time. I have a lot of work to do.
She turned away so that he wouldn't see her cold gaze. Derek paused, realizing that the conversation was over. He did not know that his wife had been living by inertia for a long time, having lost interest in everything he had to offer. For her, their marriage had become a cage that had once seemed perfect, but was now strangling her. A few weeks later, Louise met Mr. Johnson. He was completely different from Derek Older, more experienced, with a dark past that only added to his charisma. This was the type of man that Louise didn't even think she would ever be interested in. But their conversations, his confidence and calmness made her feel alive. One day she told Carol about a new acquaintance, to which she was surprised.
Louise, you're happy with Derek, aren't you? Why would you even think about someone else?
Are you happy? Maybe. But this is not the happiness you think about. It's just a convenience. And you know, sometimes I want something more, something. The real one.
Carol sighed heavily again, but couldn't find the words to answer. She knew that Louise had always lived by her own rules, and nothing seemed to have changed. Louise's past revealed why she had become so cynical and why her life with Derek could not satisfy her. She had always been looking for stability, not love, but now that she had got everything she wanted, it stopped making her happy. Mr. Johnson became the forbidden fruit for her, which disrupted her carefully planned life. Louise's life was rolling along the usual rut, but her inner state was more and more like a bubbling cauldron that was about to explode. Derek continued to be the perfect husband, whom she chose not for love, but for stability. She knew that she had everything she had ever dreamed of: a big house, financial independence, and respect from society. But inside, it all began to seem empty and meaningless. Every day became a monotonous routine for her. Louise woke up, went to work, talked to clients, performed her duties, but it was all mechanical. She might be an interior designer, but her own life seemed colourless to her, as if she were in a house where all the walls were grey and the furniture was outdated. She found herself thinking that she was constantly being pulled beyond this world of comfort, but she couldn't figure out what exactly was wrong with her. And then one day everything changed when a new resident, Mr. Johnson, moved into the next house. The first time she saw him was when she got out of the car after returning from work. He was standing outside his new house, leaning against the fence, surveying his new territory. His age was immediately obvious. He was much older than her, about 40 years old, and maybe more. The grey hair covering his head and the deep wrinkles on his face suggested that he was over 70. But that didn't make him any less interesting to Louise. On the contrary, there was something about him that immediately caught her attention. Mr. Johnson was tall, and his figure was still sturdy despite his age. He was dressed in ordinary jeans and a simple shirt, but even in such modest clothes he looked surprisingly confident. There was that wisdom in his eyes that only comes with age, and Louise felt a strange attraction that she couldn't explain. She met his gaze for a moment, and that moment was enough for her inner world to begin to change. In the days that followed, she noticed him more and more often. Sometimes he stood in the yard and repaired something. Sometimes he just walked down the street. Louise involuntarily began to look for his gaze every time she left the house. She was attracted to him not so much by his appearance, but by the unshakable self-confidence that permeated his every gesture. It was the kind of confidence that Derek didn't have, despite all his successes and efforts. Every day, Louise wondered more and more about why she was so attracted to this elderly man. Her marriage to Derek seemed like a safe choice, a perfect deal. But now, looking at Mr. Johnson, she began to doubt the correctness of this choice. Unlike Derek, Mr. Johnson wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't obsessed with being perfect like her husband was. On the contrary, he lived the way he wanted, without trying to adjust to anyone's expectations. And it was this independence and confidence that became something new and attractive for Louise. One morning, as she was going outside to go to work, Mr. Johnson was there again. This time he was sitting on a bench in front of his house, reading a newspaper. Louise slowed her pace, glancing at him, and, sensing his attention, froze for a moment. Noticing her presence, he looked up from the newspaper and nodded, as if greeting an old acquaintance. There was a lightness in that simple gesture that she had missed so much in her life with Derek. From that moment on, Louise began to look for reasons to run into him. She went out for a walk around the area, hoping to see him in the yard, or purposely lingered near her car, pretending that she had forgotten something. Gradually, a tacit understanding was established between them every time they met eyes. It was as if a silent dialogue was taking place between them. She felt that Mr. Johnson noticed her interest, but did not take a single step to break this fragile boundary that they both seemed to understand. Several weeks passed in such innocent encounters, until one evening Louise found herself on the street alone, strolling through her neighborhood to clear her head after another day. She was thinking that her marriage to Derek had become more like a business partnership than a relationship. He was doing his best to please her, but it was getting more and more annoying for her. His constant care, his willingness to always be there for her became a burden. Louise stopped at Mr. Johnson's fence, mechanically looking at his house. At that time, the door opened and he went outside, looking at her. Their eyes met again, but this time something was different. He walked up to her, stopping just a few steps away. This moment seemed endless to her, filled with tension. She could feel her heart beating faster. From that evening, their relationship began to develop. They exchanged brief but deep glances at first, which said more than any words. Then conversations began between them, light, casual, but full of hidden meaning. Louise felt that she was becoming more and more attracted to this man. His age no longer mattered. On the contrary, his experience and life wisdom seemed to her something that she lacked in her young but empty marriage with Derek. She often thought that Mr. Johnson was the man who could teach her something new, show her a different way. Unlike Derek, who tried to please and conform to her wishes, Mr. Johnson was himself. He didn't need approval, didn't strive to be perfect for her. He was completely independent, and that was what attracted her the most. Soon their meetings became more frequent. Louise started spending more time with him, going out for walks and talking about life. These conversations were so deep that every time she felt refreshed after talking to him. He talked about things she had never discussed with Derek, about life, about old age, about the importance of not wasting time. He opened her eyes to things she hadn't noticed before, and it fascinated her more and more. Over time, she began to realize that her attraction to Mr. Johnson went beyond mere interest. She thought about him when she was with Derek, imagined their meetings and looked forward to them. These thoughts began to fill her mind, crowding out everything else. She could no longer ignore the fact that her marriage to Derek was just a shell, devoid of real feelings. Louise began to realize that her connection with Mr. Johnson was more than just a passing infatuation for her. It was something that flowed from the depths of her soul that she couldn't control. It was a real attraction, based not on money, not on stability, but on something deeper. She felt alive next to him, while her life with Derek became more and more dull and monotonous. Every time she returned home after meeting Mr. Johnson, she felt an inner conflict. Her mind told her that she had to stop it. But her heart, which had not been occupied with love for a long time, told her otherwise. She understood that she was attracted to this man not only by his confidence and maturity, but also by the fact that he was something new, forbidden and dangerous. She knew that her connection with him could destroy everything she had built with Derek, but she couldn't stop. At some point, Louise realized that her attraction to Mr. Johnson had become too strong for her to ignore. She no longer saw any point in continuing to pretend that her life with Derek was okay with her. Mr. Johnson became to her what she really wanted. He was a symbol of freedom, of the life she had lost in the routine of her marriage, and Louise was willing to risk everything in order to feel alive again. Louise did not notice how her life slowly began to split into two parts. On the one hand, there was her familiar world, a house with immaculately manicured lawns, a caring and predictable husband, Derek, and the illusion of an ideal life, which they diligently maintained for society. On the other hand, there was Mr. Johnson, his confident demeanor, his calmness, his unfailing indifference to social norms. And if at first their meetings were just innocent moments of light flirtation, now it has become something more than Louise could have imagined. She did not notice how she began to spend more and more time thinking about Mr. Johnson. Every look he gave her, every fleeting gesture, every hint of their possible relationship, it all excited her. Louise felt that with him, she could be someone she had never been with Derek. She was attracted to him not only physically, but also emotionally. He became for her a symbol of freedom and life outside the framework and conventions. The secret meetings began by chance, as if the circumstances themselves had pushed them towards each other. One evening, when Derek was busy at work and stayed late at the office, Louise decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to refresh her thoughts. She knew that she would most likely meet Mr. Johnson, and inwardly she was already ready for this meeting. She was looking for him, and he was there, as always, in his place, in his yard, as if he was waiting for her on purpose. They didn't talk much that night. They didn't need words. Everything has been said before in their looks, in their casual touches, in the strange chemistry that arose between them from the very beginning. Louise came closer to him, and this step was the beginning of their hidden relationship. Mr. Johnson was as calm as ever, but now his calmness began to attract her even more. It seemed to her that there was something magnetic about him, something she had never experienced around Derek. This elderly man suddenly became for her not just an object of fascination, but a person with whom she felt truly alive. They began to see each other more often. Louise came up with various excuses to spend time with Mr. Johnson. She told Derek that she was working on projects for work, meeting with clients, or participating in business meetings. Derek, always busy with his own affairs, did not ask unnecessary questions. He used to trust his wife. His blind faith in her devotion gave Louise complete freedom for her secrets. These meetings with Mr. Johnson were like a breath of fresh air for her. They didn't need romantic restaurants or long trips. Their meetings were short, but filled with passion and tension. They could just walk in the park or sit in his house, talking about life. But each such moment filled her with an energy she hadn't experienced in a long time. Gradually, the connection between them ceased to be only physical. Louise felt that she was attracted to Mr. Johnson on an emotional level. She began to tell him about her doubts and fears, about how her life with Derek was stifling her, how she felt trapped. And although Mr. Johnson rarely opened up on his own, his presence and rare but apt comments supported her. He did not try to judge or criticize her. He was just there, ready to listen and accept her for who she was. For Louise, this relationship was not just an affair on the side, it was her escape from reality. Mr. Johnson represented a part of her life that she had never had. He was her secret, her little refuge where she could be herself. For the first time in a long time, Louise began to feel that she was in control of her destiny, that her life was not governed solely by the rules and norms of society. She felt free. However, every day her lying to Derek became more difficult. Louise knew that she was playing a dangerous game, and that sooner or later Derek might find out the truth. But she couldn't stop. This double life gave her the thrill that was so lacking in her marriage. Derek was the epitome of stability for her, but that stability no longer brought her satisfaction. She wanted something more, something new. And Mr. Johnson was the key that opened up this new world for her. Gradually, Louise began to spend more and more time away from home, coming up with more and more complex excuses for her trips and meetings. She became a master of stealth. She constantly made sure that her actions did not arouse suspicion in Derek. She carefully thought out every step. Every detail of her lie was thought out to the smallest detail. But inside she knew that her life was now a house of cards that could collapse at any moment. Louise's internal conflict was growing. On the one hand, she understood that her relationship with Mr. Johnson was a temporary infatuation that could not last forever. She knew that sooner or later it would all end, and she would be forced to return to her usual life with Derek. But on the other hand, she was attracted to this man so much that she couldn't break away from this passion. She felt like she had finally found something she had always missed, and now she couldn't let it go. Each of their meetings was like the last breath before the storm. Louise knew that sooner or later their relationship would become known, and this moment filled her with both fear and excitement. She began to notice that her behavior was changing not only with Mr. Johnson, but also at home. She became less tolerant of Derek, getting annoyed about little things that hadn't bothered her before. Every time he tried to express his love and care, her irritation only increased. Now she saw in him only an obstacle to the freedom she had found with Mr. Johnson. But the scariest thing for Louise was that she couldn't stop. She knew her life was on the verge of destruction, but she continued to date Mr. Johnson anyway, feeling the adrenaline rush of their secret trysts. Every time they met, her heart beat faster, her mind clouded, and all her principles and moral beliefs disappeared. She was gripped by the feeling that she was doing something wrong, forbidden, but this only made their connection more attractive. One day, returning home after one of her meetings with Mr. Johnson, Louise felt that her world was about to collapse. Her marriage to Derek was just a facade that could no longer hide the storm that was going on inside her. She knew she couldn't live this life alone, but she couldn't imagine how to admit her feelings and destroy everything she and Derek had built. She was torn by contradictions. On the one hand, she wanted to continue her secret relationship. On the other, she understood that by doing this she was ruining not only her life, but also Derek's life. She sat in the bedroom for a long time, trying to realize that her life was being torn apart. Her love for Mr. Johnson had become too strong to ignore, but her marriage to Derek still trapped her. Louise knew she was on the verge of making a decision that would change her life forever. She knew she couldn't lead a double life forever. Sooner or later, she will have to make a choice, and this choice will be painful for all involved in this story. Her feelings were so confused that she could no longer distinguish right from wrong. Mr. Johnson became for her a symbol of the freedom she had been looking for so long. But the price of that freedom was too high. She knew her betrayal would hurt Derek, who loved her with all his heart. But despite all these realizations, she couldn't stop herself. There was only the unknown ahead, and Louise was willing to risk everything to find out where this path would lead her. For Derek, life went on as usual, and he was sure that everything was going the way it should be. His marriage to Louise always seemed perfect to him, because he did everything possible to make her happy. He never thought that anything could go wrong. For him, their life was arranged. They had a big, beautiful house, reliable friends, well-being and stability. They went to social events together, where they were considered the perfect couple, and no one would have suspected that something else was hiding behind this picture of an ideal family. However, over time, Derek began to notice minor changes in Louise's behavior. At first, these were minor things. She began to leave more often in the evenings, explaining this by work or meetings with friends, and began to spend more time outside the house than usual. He didn't want to think about the bad things, blamed everything on her busy schedule. It seemed to him that she was just tired of work, and therefore became more withdrawn and detached. But over time, his concern began to grow. Louise began to spend less time with him, avoided conversations, and avoided any attempts to discuss her feelings or share what was bothering her. There was no longer the genuine joy in her eyes that he was used to seeing before. Derek often recalled their moments together, trips, holidays, those moments when they were really happy. Now it all seemed like a distant memory to him. While his love for Louise did not weaken, he felt that something had changed. A feeling of anxiety began to arise inside him, which he had been trying to suppress for a long time. But the more time passed, the more anxious he became. He could no longer ignore the obvious signs of her detachment. Louise began to stay late more often, coming home late at night or even early in the morning, explaining this by meetings with clients or work. Her excuses seemed plausible, but there was something in her tone that betrayed a coldness and indifference that Derek hadn't noticed before. He tried not to ask unnecessary questions, not wanting to seem suspicious or intrusive. He had always trusted Louise, and that trust was the foundation of their marriage. But now, as his suspicions began to grow, that trust was shaken. Derek couldn't help but think about what was going on behind his back, even though he tried to reassure himself that it was just his stress-induced fantasies. At some point, he began to notice even stranger things. Louise began to carry her phone with her all the time, and when he accidentally saw her correspondence, she immediately hid the screen. If she used to leave her phone on the table or sofa, not paying attention to where it was, now it was always next to her. Derek began to notice that she checked messages when he wasn't looking, and often smiled when she read them. He wanted to ask her what these messages were, who was writing to her, but he restrained himself, afraid to ruin their relationship with his suspicions. Despite his best efforts to remain calm, Derek was becoming more and more doubtful. One evening, when Louise said she had another meeting with a client and she would be back late, he decided to follow her. This decision was not easy for him. He did not want to be the husband who spies on his wife, but the anxiety inside became so strong that he could no longer ignore it. Derek followed her at a short distance, trying not to attract attention. He saw her get into the car and drive towards the city, but soon turned onto a small street that led to the houses of their neighbors. He froze when he saw that she had stopped at Mr. Johnson's house. Louise got out of the car and went to the door, which was immediately opened by Johnson himself. Derek stayed where he was, not believing his eyes. His wife entered the house, and the door closed behind her. Derek's world turned upside down at that moment. He couldn't believe that Louise, his ideal wife, could actually cheat on him with this elderly neighbor. He stood in the shadows, watching the house with the lights on, and his thoughts whirled in his head. He wanted to rush in there, break into the house and demand an explanation. But he couldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the ground, and his heart was beating so hard that he could barely breathe. It was something he had never expected. There had never been a place for betrayal in his life, and now he was forced to face this painful truth. Derek slowly turned around and walked back home. Each step he took was heavier than the last, and when he finally reached their house, it seemed to him that he was carrying an unbearable burden. He sat in the kitchen, staring into space, not knowing what to do next. Emotions raged inside him: anger, pain, confusion, resentment. He wanted to scream, but he just sat there, unable to move. He couldn't sleep at night, tossing and turning in the bed where he and Louise had recently shared everything. When she returned home, her face was calm, as if nothing had happened. She kissed him on the cheek and went to bed, leaving him alone with his thoughts. It was the moment when he finally realized that Louise had betrayed him. Over the next few days, Derek tried to behave as usual, but inside he felt like his heart was breaking. He couldn't look at Louise with the same eyes anymore. All the care and attention she had shown seemed fake now. It hurt him every time she smiled or touched him, because he knew there was a lie behind that smile. He thought about how long it had been going on, trying to remember all the little things that had seemed insignificant before, but now formed one terrible picture. Derek remembered all those moments when Louise was distant, when she came home late, when she avoided his eyes. It all made new sense now, and it was unbearable for him to realize that he was so blind. As the days passed, Derek sank deeper into his thoughts and suspicions. He couldn't just accept betrayal, but at the same time he didn't know how to deal with it. His love for Louise had not faded, but now it was tinged with pain and disappointment. He didn't know how to live with this truth anymore. He couldn't just forgive her, but it was too painful for him to destroy their marriage. Derek was trapped between his feelings and reality. Every night Louise returned home, and each time Derek felt more and more detached. He tried to avoid talking so as not to betray his suspicions, but a storm of emotions was already boiling inside him. He knew that he would not be able to remain silent for long, and that sooner or later he would have to face the truth face to face. Eventually, one night, when Louise returned home late again, Derek couldn't hold back his emotions any longer. All the moments of their marriage flashed through his mind, all her false promises and his blind belief that their love was real. He was sitting in the dark, waiting for her to return, and when she entered the house, he did not pretend that everything was all right. It was the moment when the whole truth came out. After Derek finally realized the depth of his wife's betrayal, it took him a while to come to his senses. He couldn't confront Louise right away. There were too many emotions, too many questions that he was afraid to hear the answers to. However, the pain, anger, and resentment grew inside him every day, and he realized that he could no longer remain silent. Sooner or later, he will have to demand an explanation, face the truth, and decide what to do next. Louise, despite her charm and secrecy, still began to feel a change in Derek. She noticed that he had become more silent and distant. He no longer looked at her the way he used to, did not do those little things that used to fill their marriage with comfort and warmth. It was familiar to her, but she tried to ignore it, continuing to lead a double life. Louise thought she could control the situation, keep Derek in the dark, and keep her relationship with Mr. Johnson a secret. But she underestimated how devastating the consequences of her actions could be. Derek, feeling that his patience was running out, one day decided that he could no longer postpone the conversation. He had been preparing for this moment for a long time, replaying in his head what this conversation would look like, what words he would say, how she would respond. But he couldn't prepare for what really happened. That evening, when Louise returned home late again, nothing could be the same as before. Derek sat in a dark room, thinking about how their life had turned into an illusion. When Louise entered the house, she was greeted by an icy silence. Usually, Derek was glad to have her back, but this time it was different. She felt the tension in the air, and it made her tense up internally. Deep down, Louise knew that this moment was inevitable, the moment when everything would become clear, when her lies would come out. And now this moment has come. Derek didn't ask her direct questions right away, but his look said more than his words. Soon the tension broke, and he demanded an explanation. His voice was full of pain and disappointment. He didn't need any more hidden hints or clues, he knew the truth, and now he wanted to hear it from Louise. He wanted to understand how this could happen. How could a man he had trusted all his life betray him so cruelly? Louise, realizing that her secret was revealed, at first tried to deny everything. But seeing that it was pointless, she finally confessed what had happened. Her confession was cold and emotionless, as if she had been preparing for this moment for a long time, and was now just playing her role. She explained that she had never really loved him, that their marriage was a convenience for her. Yes, at the beginning of their life together, she enjoyed his care, his attention and generosity. But over time, this idyll began to bother her, and her feelings for Derek faded, if they had ever been real. Louise admitted that her relationship with Mr. Johnson is not just a fleeting affair. She was attracted to him as a person who was her opposite. Mr. Johnson represented freedom for her from the conventions that she had come to hate in her family life. He was a symbol of something new to her, something she couldn't experience with Derek. His confidence, independence, and experience attracted her so much that she couldn't resist. All this time, Louise tried to keep her feelings under control, but she realized that their connection with Mr. Johnson was too strong to ignore. For Derek, this confession was devastating. He sat listening to her words and felt his world, which he had built so diligently, crumbling right before his eyes. Everything he knew and loved disappeared in an instant. His illusion of an ideal family, which was based on his love and care, was destroyed overnight. Louise not only betrayed him, but also showed that she had never really appreciated him. Derek couldn't stay in the same house with the woman who betrayed him so much anymore. He left, leaving Louise alone in their once cozy and warm house, which has now become an empty and alien place for him. He wandered the streets, not knowing where to go, trying to figure out what had just happened. The pain was overwhelming him, and he didn't know how to deal with it. He lost not only his wife, but also the very belief that their love was real. In the following days, Louise tried to justify her actions to herself. She knew that she had made a choice that changed their lives forever, and now she had to live with that choice. She moved in with Mr. Johnson, hoping that her life with him would be the same as in her dreams. But the reality turned out to be much more complicated than she could have imagined. Mr. Johnson was fascinating to her at the beginning of their relationship, but when they started living together, everything changed. His habits and lifestyle, which seemed so attractive and free to her, began to depress her. He was too independent, too used to his loneliness, and it began to put pressure on Louise. She lacked the stability and care she had with Derek. Mr. Johnson was confident in himself, but this confidence often turned into indifference. He didn't need her the way Derek did, and it made her realize that she had made a mistake. Louise gradually began to realize that she had exchanged real care and love for fleeting emotions. Her life with Mr. Johnson was far from ideal. He was not the one who could support her in difficult moments, was not the one who was ready to share her life completely with her. They began to live like two strangers under the same roof. The passion that had burned between them in the beginning began to fade, and Louise realized that she had made a mistake. She started thinking about Derek, how he was always there for her, how he took care of her. Now she realized that his love was sincere, but she couldn't appreciate it in time. Her choice had destroyed everything they had, and now she found herself in a situation where there was no love, no stability, no happiness. Life didn't get any better for Derek either after their breakup. He had lost the woman he loved, and now he had to rebuild his life from scratch. He felt betrayed and devastated. His faith in love was shattered, and he didn't know if he would ever be able to trust anyone again. Derek began to avoid society, became withdrawn and detached. His friends tried to support him, but he couldn't get rid of the feeling of loneliness and pain that still wouldn't let go of him. Louise, finding herself in a situation where her life with Mr. Johnson became unbearable, began to think about how to get everything back. But she knew that what she had done could not be undone. She had made a choice that had ruined her life with Derek, and now she had to live with that decision to the end. She knew that Derek would never forgive her, and she couldn't forgive herself for betraying the man who loved her more than anything in the world. In the end, their lives were ruined. Louise has lost everything: love, stability, and her dreams of a new life with Mr. Johnson. Derek lost his faith in love and was left alone, with the pain and disappointment that became his constant companions. Their story became a tragedy where lies and betrayal destroyed everything they once had.